the sea turned black before dawn. Not from weather, not from storm, from ships, from the silhouettes of 180 vessels moving in tight formation through the dark water, their oars pulling in rhythm, their gun decks loaded and ready. From the sails of the largest invasion fleet the Mediterranean had seen in a generation. It was the 18th of May, 1565. The island was Malta, and the men who stood on its walls watching the horizon fill with Ottoman steel had known this moment was coming for years. They had built their walls for it. They had trained for it. They had prayed for it to come on their terms, in the right season, with enough men and ammunition to make the cost unbearable. None of those conditions had been fully met. The Ottoman Empire had consumed everything between Persia and Morocco. It had broken Hungary at Mohacs. It had absorbed the Balkans whole. It had taken Constantinople and renamed it, turning the greatest Christian city in the East into the capital of an Islamic empire that now stretched across 3 continents. Its Sultan Suleiman had ruled for 44 years. He had personally commanded 13 military campaigns. His armies had stood at the gates of Vienna. His fleets had swept the Venetians from the eastern Mediterranean. He had never lost a war, and the world knew it. There was one thing left undone. A small Christian fortress in the centre of his sea, held by a few hundred warrior monks with old wounds and older grudges. The Knights of St. John. Suleiman called them pirates. He called them the sons of dogs. They had raided his shipping. They had intercepted his supply lines. They had freed slaves from his galleys and seized cargo from his merchants, and done it all from an island he had not yet had the patience to eliminate. They had also humiliated him once before. At Rhodes in 1522, Suleiman had sent an army of 100,000 men against the Knights. The siege had lasted 5 months and cost him 50,000 dead. He had won, eventually. He had driven the Knights off the island at sword point. But he had made an error that haunted him afterward. He had allowed them to leave with their lives, their weapons, and their banners intact. He had shown mercy to enemies who did not recognize mercy as a reason to stop fighting. For 40 years from Malta they had been proving him right. Now he was coming to finish it. And this time there would be no terms. If Malta fell, the door to Europe cracked open. Sicily sat 40 miles to the north. Naples lay beyond that. Rome, the symbolic heart of the Christian world, was within reach of an empire that had already swallowed Constantinople. The entire southern shore of Europe, from Spain to the Italian peninsula, would be exposed to a fleet that would have no opposition. This was not a raid. This was not a siege for territory. This was the opening move in the conquest of the Western world. The men on Malta's walls understood exactly what was at stake. Not just their lives. Not just their island. Every kingdom, every city, every person living in the Europe that lay north and west of the island they were standing on. Everything. This is the story of the Great Siege of Malta. The summer when the fate of a civilization was decided on a limestone rock by a handful of old soldiers who refused to be moved. To understand why 40,000 Ottoman warriors crossed the Mediterranean to attack a barren island, one must understand both what that island had become and the man who had made it. Jean Parisot de Valette was 70 years old when the Ottoman fleet appeared on the horizon. He had been born into the lesser French nobility, taken his vows as a knight at the age of 20, and spent the next 5 decades fighting the Ottomans in every form the conflict could take. He had survived Rhodes. He had rowed as an Ottoman galley slave for a full year, chained to an oar before a prisoner exchange brought him back. He had commanded galleys, led raids, negotiated with kings, and watched the slow erosion of Christendom's eastern frontier with the patience of a man who had accepted that the war would outlast most of the men fighting it. He had been Grand Master of the Knights since 1557. In 8 years he had rebuilt Malta's defences, reinforced its garrisons, and stockpiled everything a siege required: food, powder, water, medical supplies, and, most critically, the conviction that the island was worth defending to the last man. He had also been brutally honest with himself about the odds. When word reached him in the spring of 1565 that the Ottoman fleet was assembling, he sent urgent messages to Sicily, to Naples, to Rome, to the King of Spain, to every Christian power that had an interest in Malta not falling. He asked for soldiers. He asked for ships. He asked for a relief force that could arrive before his garrison was destroyed. The replies were cautious. non-committal. Politicians weighing the cost of intervention against the cost of failure. Valette stopped waiting for promises. He sealed Malta's harbours and prepared to fight alone. Suleiman had sent 2 commanders. Mustafa Pasha, a veteran of 30 years of Ottoman warfare, methodical, patient, experienced in the mechanics of siegecraft, and Piale Pasha, the admiral of the fleet, younger and more aggressive, who viewed the campaign as an opportunity for personal glory and resented sharing command with a man who moved too slowly for his taste. The 2 men despised each other and could not agree on basic strategy from the moment they arrived. Mustafa wanted a direct assault on the main fortifications. Piale wanted to secure the harbour first, to protect the fleet from storms and from any Christian relief force that might attempt to intervene. The argument cost them days that would later be measured in thousands of bodies. In the end, they agreed on a compromise that neither wanted. They would begin with the small fort at the mouth of the harbour. Fort St. Elmo. Fort Saint. Elmo was not built to stop an empire. It was a compact star-shaped fortification perched on a narrow peninsula of rock, positioned to guard the entrance to the grand harbour. Its walls were old and not particularly thick. Its garrison was approximately 700 men, knights, Spanish regulars and Maltese volunteers. Its guns were sufficient to threaten ships attempting to enter the harbour, but it had no depth of defence, no room for retreat, no reserves to call on. When Mustafa Pasha surveyed it, he gave it 4 days. He was catastrophically wrong. The Ottoman bombardment opened on the 24th of May with guns capable of firing stone balls weighing 160 pounds. They fired without pause, rotating gun crews so the barrels never fully cooled, hammering the fort's parapets into rubble from positions on the high ground overlooking it. By the end of the first day, entire sections of the landward wall had been reduced to broken stone. The defenders who had been standing on those walls moments before were buried beneath it. And then that night the survivors began to rebuild. They worked in darkness, carrying stone and timber to the gaps, filling the breaches with anything that would absorb a cannon shot. They had no illusions about permanence. The guns would return at dawn and tear down what the night had built. But every hour of work was an hour the Ottomans could not walk through unopposed. So they worked through the dark with bleeding hands and hauled their dead clear to make room for the living, and waited for the sun to come up and the guns to start again. The pattern held for days. Bombardment at dawn. Repair at night. And when the Ottoman infantry finally came through the breaches in force, the defenders met them with something the attackers had not anticipated. Fire. Incendiary hoops, rings of wood and iron wrapped in cloth and soaked in oil and pitch, set ablaze and thrown directly into the assault formations packing the breach. Men wearing armour found themselves on fire with no way to remove it quickly. The screaming was audible across the harbour. The attacks broke and reformed and broke again, wave after wave, colliding with a garrison that refused to behave like a garrison that had already lost. Valette watched it all from Fort Saint. Angelo across the water. He received reports each morning of the previous night's casualties. He read the letters that came back from Elmo, letters from commanders describing a situation that grew worse each day, from men who knew they would not survive the summer and wrote as clearly as they could about what they needed and what they feared would not come. He sent what he could. Reinforcements crossed the harbour each night in small boats under fire, men who understood they were rowing toward a fort that had no future because Valette had asked them to. Some of his council urged him to abandon the fort, to concentrate all forces on the main defences and let Elmo fall. Every man spent on Elmo, they argued, was a man who would not be on the walls of Birgu when the real assault came. Valette listened to these arguments and rejected them every time. Fort Elmo was not simply a fortification. Every day it held was a day Mustafa's timetable fell further behind. Every day it held was a day the Ottoman army sat in its camp, burning through food and powder, and losing men to dysentery and skirmishes instead of advancing on the main harbours. Every day it held was a day closer to autumn, when the weather would make the harbour untenable for Piale's fleet, and closer to a relief force that Valette could not be certain was coming, but could not afford to stop believing in. He kept sending men across the water. They kept going. Fort Saint. Elmo held for 31 days. 31 days of continuous bombardment and infantry assault. 31 days of nightly repair and daily destruction, and men fighting in rubble so dense that the dead could not be fully cleared from the fighting positions. By the final week, the garrison was almost entirely casualties. The walls were unrecognizable. The ditches in front were filled with the bodies of Ottoman soldiers who had died reaching them. On the night of the 22nd of June, the survivors gathered in what remained of the fort's chapel. They wrote final letters. They gave their valuables to servants with instructions to attempt escape by sea. They made their confessions to the priests who had stayed with them. At dawn on the 23rd, the Ottomans came through the walls for the last time. The remaining defenders could not stand. Some had been wounded so many times that they could only sit upright against the broken stone and lift their weapons toward the men coming through the breach. The knights died there in the ruins without ground enough left to retreat to. Mustafa Pasha walked through the captured fort as the last fighting ended. He looked at the rubble. He looked at the bodies of the men who had held it. He looked at the count of his own dead. 8,000 soldiers. To take one small fort he had given 4 days. He stood at the water's edge and stared across the harbour at Fort Saint. Angelo at the walls of Birgu and Senglea rising behind it, at the defences that had watched Fort Elmo die and still stood unmoved. What had happened here was not in any calculation he had made. What would those walls cost? Valette received word of Elfall's fall and gave no outward sign of grief. He had known it was coming. He had sent those men knowing it was coming. What mattered now was what came next. And what came next was 40,000 Ottoman soldiers, with their full attention finally turned on the main harbours. When the Ottomans sent Elmo's fallen knights across the harbour on wooden crosses, Valette responded without hesitation. Every Ottoman prisoner on Malta was executed. Their heads were loaded into the cannons of Fort Saint. Angelo and fired back toward the Ottoman camp. His message required no translation. The Ottoman siege of Birgu and Senglea began with a bombardment that made the assault on Elmo sound like preparation. Thousands of cannon rounds per day, fired from multiple batteries on the surrounding heights, tearing into walls that the knights had spent years fortifying, but could not make impervious to guns of this size. Entire sections collapsed. The ground shook without pause. The air in the harbours filled permanently with stone dust and the smell of burning powder. The assaults that followed the bombardments were overwhelming in their scale. The Ottomans had enough men to rotate fresh troops into each attack, while the defenders, stretched across a long perimeter with no reserve left to speak of, fought without rotation, without rest, without any certainty that the man standing beside them that morning would still be there by evening. Valette was in the breaches with them. He had taken a wound to his leg but refused to leave the walls. He moved between crisis points in the line, appearing exactly where the situation was worst, fighting alongside his soldiers with a pike in his hands. The effect on morale was impossible to calculate and impossible to overstate. Men who might have broken in the anonymity of a collapsing defence chose to stand when they could see their Grand Master bleeding in the rubble beside them. The Ottomans nearly ended it on the 7th of August. A meticulously planned, coordinated assault struck Senglea simultaneously from the water and the land. Ottoman engineers had cut through the defensive chain boom stretched across the harbour mouth, opening a path for assault boats. Dozens of vessels, packed tightly with soldiers, drove hard towards Senglea's seawall, while the main Ottoman infantry hit the landward defences at the identical moment. Both attacks landed at once, designed to split the garrison's attention and resources beyond the point of recovery. For an hour, it worked. The seawall was reached. The landward defences were under severe pressure at multiple points simultaneously. Valette was moving reserves from one crisis to another, stripping positions to reinforce positions, making calculations that had no good answer. Then the guns on Fort Saint. Angelo spoke. A battery he had positioned with exactly this moment in mind, angled to fire across the harbour into the water below Senglea's walls. The rounds hit the packed assault boats at point-blank range, in tight formation with nowhere to manoeuvre. The result was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The Ottoman Seaburn assault ceased to exist in minutes. The swimmers who had cut the boom drowned or died from grape shot. The soldiers in the boats died without reaching the walls. The land assault, hearing the screaming from the water, lost its momentum for just long enough. The line held. Through August, the siege became something different. It became a slow, grinding test of which side would stop functioning first. The Ottomans were bleeding in ways that did not show in the assault counts. Dysentery had moved through the camps from the beginning, but by August it was killing men without a fight, men who had survived every assault, dying in their tents from water that had been fouled by weeks of siege. The summer heat of Malta, which the island's stone absorbed and radiated back at double intensity, wore at men unaccustomed to it. Supply lines from Constantinople were long and insufficient. Powder was being rationed, and Mustafa and Piale's mutual contempt had curdled into open dysfunction, with each commander making decisions without consulting the other, and then refusing responsibility for their consequences. Inside the fortifications, the situation was its own kind of horror. Of the force that had begun the siege in May, fewer than a third remained capable of fighting. The wounded occupied every structure not needed for active defence. Surgeons worked without pause and without adequate supplies. Ammunition had been rationed so tightly that gun crews waited for clear shots rather than firing with any frequency. The Maltese civilians who had refused to evacuate, because there was nowhere to evacuate to, worked the walls alongside soldiers. Women carried powder and water. Old men who could no longer swing weapons handled supply lines through rubble-choked streets. Children kept the powder chains moving during assaults. Valette still walked the walls every day. He was asked repeatedly whether the relief would come. He said the same thing every time. God decides. He went back to the walls. On the 7th of September, the relief came. Nearly 10,000 Spanish soldiers from Sicily landed on the northwest coast of Malta. They were late. They had been delayed by governors in Palermo and Naples who had spent months debating whether intervention was worth the risk, by advisors who feared a second Elmo, by the slow calculus of men deciding the fate of an island they were not standing on. But they came. Mustafa heard the news and understood immediately that the mathematics had changed beyond recovery. His army had spent the summer against walls that had not fallen. His casualty count across the full siege was approaching 30,000. His powder was down to days of supply. His men were sick, exhausted, and demoralized by months of assault against a garrison that should have been destroyed in July. Fresh troops at his rear meant a second front. 2 fronts meant the end. He assembled his forces for one final assault on the 8th of September. The walls held. On the 11th of September, 1565, the Ottoman fleet raised its anchors and turned east toward Constantinople. The largest invasion force the Mediterranean had seen in a generation sailed away from the island it had failed to take. Malta remained. The silence that followed the fleet's departure settled over the island slowly, like something the survivors needed time to believe. They walked the rubble of what had been their homes, their walls, their churches, and found almost nothing that the siege had not touched. Birgu's streets were barely passable. Senglea's seawall was a jagged ruin. The ground everywhere smelled of smoke and rot, and the particular stillness of places where the dead had not all been properly buried because the living had not had time to do it. The knights counted what remained. Of the approximately 9,000 defenders who had entered the siege, fewer than 600 were fit to bear arms. The Ottoman dead numbered somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000. The estimates varied because no one had counted systematically, because the sea had taken many, and because Mustafa's commanders had not been in the habit of accurate accounting when the numbers were this damaging. Valette accepted the honours that came, the congratulations from the Pope, the letters from the King of Spain, the recognition of every Christian court in Europe, and set them aside without particular interest. He stayed on Malta. He supervised the construction of a new fortified city on the ridge above the Grand Harbour, built from the stone of the island and the rubble of everything the siege had destroyed, designed by the best military engineers in Europe, funded by the grateful contributions of the powers whose coasts had remained intact because a small island had not fallen. He named it Valletta. He died there 3 years later, in 1568. Still on the island, still in command, still by all accounts looking toward the sea. Europe called it a miracle. The Pope ordered it commemorated. Painters covered vast canvases with the battles. The defeat of the Ottoman siege became the symbol of something that Europe had stopped believing, that the advance could be stopped, that walls could hold, that an outnumbered garrison fighting without reasonable hope of survival could change the course of history. 6 years later, at the Battle of Lepanto, the combined Christian fleets broke Ottoman naval supremacy in the Mediterranean. Historians often frame Lepanto as the turning point. But the turning had begun here, on a limestone island in the centre of the sea, in the summer of 1565, when a 70-year-old man with a wounded leg refused to leave his walls. The Ottoman Empire did not collapse. It ruled and fought and expanded in other directions for centuries more. It remained one of the most formidable states in the world for long after 1565. But it never came for Malta again. The road to Rome, which had seemed so open that spring, closed on the day Mustafa's fleet turned east. It never reopened, because one man had taken a barren island that no one else wanted, built something on it worth dying for, and then died for it when the time came. And because the men who stood beside him, the knights who rowed across a dark harbour toward a fort with no future, the Maltese civilians who carried powder through streets that were falling apart around them, the soldiers who fought in rubble and refused to stop, had decided that surrender was not an answer they were willing to give. The gate holds when the people behind it refuse to let it fall. In 1565 they refused.